Look, it's very simple. If you're paying attention, if you have been paying attention, Kendrick Lamar has always been the leader of the so-called Big Three. He's always been the main influence of the other two since he released his first official album. Now, you can say whether it was by suggestions of the record companies they were signed to, or whatever excuse you want to give. The fact of the matter is, since the release of Good Kid, Mad City, everyone has been following Kendrick Lamar's lead. And that is because of the impact that his music has had. That's why if you are a fan of Kendrick, you don't have to really listen to OVO Nation and their flailing to remain relevant and for Drake to remain relevant. Some of my Kendrick Lamar fans out there, y'all sound scared like they gonna come back or Drake is gonna. It's not going to happen because he was never really on top in the first place. Okay, marketing does not mean you are the best artist. Okay, Drake is a pop artist. Pop artist, popular artist, get industry and commercial push. This is where the OVO sweatshop comes into play, the ghostwriting, the cosigns from random artists from all over the place. This is where that comes from. And this is what led Drake to his run and his popularity. One of the biggest and most successful industry creations in the history of music, period. Here in the year of our Lord 2025, one thing I'm noticing is that the split in hip hop between Drake fans and people who like more, easily digestible music versus Kendrick Lamar fans and people who like more deep and thought-provoking music and art has really split hip hop down the middle. But it is definitely not an even split, as I think more people, as proved by Kendrick Lamar being able to sell out 90% of the tickets to a stadium tour in both the United States and now throughout Europe, has shown that more people are interested in what Kendrick Lamar has to do. Now, we have to understand how big this is. Kendrick Lamar is with SZA, who is a great artist and a big artist in her own right. But for them to be able to sell out this tour, Drake has never done a stadium tour by himself. Jay-Z, who people like to crown as the GOAT, I disagree, but has never done a stadium tour without the likes of Beyonce and Justin Timberlake. All right, Eminem has never done a stadium tour without the help of the likes of Rihanna. And we all know how popular Rihanna is. Rihanna is probably the headliner in that tour when it comes to popularity. We're just gonna keep it real, right? So now, when we look at the noise surrounding Drake and his fall being so noisy from his fan base, we have to understand something. First of all, those who are fans of Kendrick Lamar are likely doing something else with their time, something constructive, because those are the kind of people who would take in Kendrick Lamar's messaging and music throughout his artistry. So they don't have time to be online all day trying to spin narratives and being obsessed with a music artist. And this has to deal with the two types of people or different types of people that they attract. Drake's fan base is very full of insecure people who kind of suffer from the same never growing up Peter Pan syndrome that he suffers from throughout his artwork. And we're gonna go through a timeline of the influence of Kendrick Lamar and how once he got to Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, which is probably his most introspective album, which is a big statement, right? Because all his albums have been introspective up to this point, but it's also an extremely mature album. This is why that album, in my opinion, led to what became the battle of 2024 between Kendrick Lamar, Drake, and partially J. Cole, but he backed out. Shout out to J. Cole. But up until that time, up until Kendrick released Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, it was very easy to follow his lead. But the subject matters within Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers and the self-introspection is something Drake did not want to follow. Now, I know those who are OVOs are not going to like that statement, but if you pay attention, it's the truth. Because what did Kendrick do? He kind of bared his soul on Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers and dug into his faults as a man, which is something that Drake and those who follow him have a hard time doing. That is really the point and the subject matter of Meet the Grams, besides the salacious, things that he revealed in the song. That is really the point in Meet the Grams. Kendrick leading Drake through a therapy session to continue to influence him as he has throughout his career. Drake has always been the student. He's just not a very good student. Bottom line. All right, let's start with Good Kid, Mad City, as I mentioned before. Now, Good Kid, Mad City came out of nowhere to kind of come to the top and rise to the top of hip hop. Everybody who listened to underground hip hop knew Kendrick was coming, right, with something like this super talented MC out of Compton. But when Good Kid, Mad City hit, it was by far and away the most influential album to be released in a decade at that time, in my opinion. Even though it's not really my favorite Kendrick album at all, right? I have it probably third in his discography, me personally. But just to kill the narrative that people are trying to say right now that the industry is somehow behind Kendrick, we have to remember that this album was not very well received by the industry. It won, I think, 1 Grammy a year after it was released. It was beat by an album that came and went in Macklemore's, I don't even remember the name of the album, but that shows you where the industry was at the time, right? And Drake was being touted as the next big thing. As the next year, his album Take Care would win Rap Album of the Year, right? And at that time, early, J. Cole was kind of following the lead of Drake. As you look at the album covers for Thank Me Later and Born Sinner, their first official album releases, being very similar, right? Now, again, that could have been the record label making J. Cole do that. But if you listen to Born Sinner, the Drake influence is definitely there. Now, though Drake had won the Grammy for Take Care and Good Kid, Mad City had lost the Grammy to Macklemore, people still heralded Good Kid, Mad City as the best hip hop album that had been released in years. And this is where Drake releases and starts working on, and the industry starts working on, the album called Nothing Was the Same. And that title is very eerily true because after the release of Good Kid, Mad City, nothing was the same for the industry and how they were trying to steer hip hop. It became a struggle to control the narrative in hip hop because Good Kid, Mad City, being the type of very soulful African-American based album that it was, I believe was not steering hip hop in the direction that the industry wanted to steer it in, which is to be more commercial friendly and less directly tied to the culture of African Americans, foundational Black Americans, and their life experience. So this would take hip hop in the direction that rock, jazz, and so many other creations of African American and foundational Black American people have been commercialized and taken away from them and used to benefit so many other cultures and not their own. So Drake continues to work on this album and it's being promoted as loosely Drake's version of Good Kid, Mad City, right? Now, through some sort of fate or whether he did it on purpose or not, we really don't know. Only Kendrick knows this. The Control verse comes out. Now, I don't think if you listen to the verse, he meant it to disrupt Drake's run of promoting Nothing Was the Same. However, this is how Drake took it, which tells you, or tells me anyway, in my opinion, that Drake saw Nothing Was the Same as a sort of response to the critically acclaimed album, Good Kid, Mad City, and the success and the critical acclaim that that album was still getting almost 2 years after it had been released. So Drake, being one of the 20 other MCs that Kendrick had took shots at in the Control verse, really took offense to Kendrick naming him in that record. And like the title of this new album said, nothing was the same after that because Drake could never get over not being able to make his version of Good Kid, Mad City, which he felt he had. And instead of admitting to the fact that maybe he just wasn't as good of an artist as Kendrick Lamar was, he blamed it on the Control verse and it interrupting the promo run, as though the promo run would make the album better or worse. The album is the album. How you promo it really shouldn't matter if your artistry is at its top level. So we get to this next example. In 2015 happens, and with no promo and out of nowhere, Kendrick Lamar drops an album called To Pimp a Butterfly. Now, for my money, this is the greatest hip hop album that has ever been made. Now, that is my opinion. I don't care if you disagree, but you can type in the comments if you do. But the impact of To Pimp a Butterfly was undeniable, and this is when the shift in hip hop started to slowly happen. Because as you can see, the other two MCs who would be considered part of the big three, and mainly Drake being the one who was being pushed as the next heir apparent to Jay-Z and Eminem, I would say, and be this creation to represent what I deemed as the Michael Jackson of hip hop. You know, the industry was going to create a Michael Jackson for hip hop, right? To Pimp a Butterfly derailed that plan, in my opinion. Why? Because Drake's next album had to match the raw artistry and realness and authenticity of To Pimp a Butterfly. So what does he do? He tries to release, and they get to working on the album, Views from the Six. Now, why do I say that this album is influenced by To Pimp a Butterfly? Not so much by subject matter, but by sound, right? Kendrick leaned into the LA and the funk sound and very African-American FBA sound throughout To Pimp a Butterfly. That's why I like the album so much. The funk, the R&B, the soul throughout the album is something that we hadn't heard too much of recently in one single project. Views from the Six, Freudian slip, I guess, is very Caribbean sounding, right? It's very Toronto sounding. It's very UK funk sounding, right? So Drake tapped into those cultural sounds, much like Kendrick tapped into his cultural sounds into Pimp a Butterfly. This was, again, now Drake is starting to follow Kendrick even more. Now Kendrick starts to sweep the Grammys in the rap categories and things like that. And he becomes, in my opinion, this is when Kendrick Lamar really became the best rapper on the planet. Even though his messaging in music and the thought-provoking nature of his music is not easily digestible by most people. Now, and in the background, J. Cole is also still following. Why? Because after Good Kid, Mad City, he released 2 years later, Forest Hill Drive, right? That's J. Cole's Good Kid, Mad City. I know J. Cole fans are very sensitive. You can argue that if you want to, but he was following Kendrick Lamar with Forest Hill Drive, okay? He was following Kendrick Lamar's influence from Good Kid, Mad City. It's basically the same album, just from a different perspective by a different artist. Okay, the KOD album, I believe, is J. Cole's version of To Pimp a Butterfly. Now, that album did not do very well. Where the difference is in Drake's Views from the Six did extremely well. I think that was his highest debuting album to date. And the funny thing about that is, it's funny to see people try to accuse Kendrick of getting an industry push. Views from the Six is not that good of an album. It's okay, but there's no way that it would have debuted like that. It was pushed from the industry. Why did it get such a push from the industry? Because they were trying to quell the impact that To Pimp a Butterfly was having. The messaging in To Pimp a Butterfly is very anti-establishment and very anti-industry. But the thing about the industry is they are prisoner to two things: influence and money. And one thing Kendrick Lamar's projects were doing was garnering influence and making money. So now we get to Kendrick releasing the album Damn. And I don't care what you say, yet again, because Damn was took a more serious tone, Drake releases Scorpion, right? These were really the first two battle albums where they were really pointing at each other. I know Kendrick Lamar did mention Drake and his ghostwriters on To Pimp a Butterfly, on King Kunta, and there's other little shots in there. But this is where they were really taking direct aim at each other with these two albums. And Damn went on to win a Pulitzer Prize. So what does that mean? Who won that war? Kendrick did, because the industry shifted. It had to shift because the art world chose Kendrick over Drake. And Kendrick's influence continued to dominate even though Drake was getting all the push. Pushing an artist costs money, whereas Kendrick didn't need the push as much. The music was pushing itself. And that's simply because Kendrick is really the better artist out of the two. He just does not fit the mold that the industry would like, and he's not willing to push the messaging that they would like, right? That's why in the Super Bowl halftime show, he says you got the right time, but the wrong guy. And the revolution is definitely being televised because the fall of Drake is the tipping point to hip hop going back to or staying in its origin and where it was meant to be, not being stolen, not being colonized by others, as many have tried. And you saw the push in the past few years since Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers released, and definitely during the battle last year. You've seen the push, one last final push to colonize hip hop culture, and it just didn't work. It's not meant to work. It's not meant to happen. Kendrick Lamar is the right guy, right at the right time for the rest of us, just not for the industry. And he has been the biggest influence in hip hop since Good Kid, Mad City, which is why that album has not left the charts since it was released 12, 13 years ago now. That's influence. And that is why when Kendrick said in the Like That feature, Mother F the Big Three, it's just Big Me, he was right.